afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our election season special webinar, Shareholder Activism Viewed as a Political Campaign. Today's event is being presented by Compro.biz and is being sponsored by the law firm of Morgan Lewis. Please be advised that today's discussion is being recorded and will be available on demand later this afternoon. While the speakers will not be walking through a formal presentation, there are a number of thoughts, leadership pieces, and presentations that have been uploaded to the event website that are available to be downloaded at your convenience but will not be needed to follow along with today's discussion. We have a number of media representatives attending today's webinar, pursuant to Chatham House rules. While the media is free to use information from the discussion, we would ask that media representatives seek permission from any panelists they want to attribute a quote to. We are hoping to make this discussion as lively and interactive as possible and welcome your questions throughout the discussion. You can either send us a question using the chat feature of the webinar platform or via Twitter using the hashtag #SHActivismPolitical. At this point, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Keith Gottfried, a partner with the law firm of Morgan Lewis and the leader of its Shareholder Activism defense practice, for some introductory remarks. Keith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, operator, and good afternoon, everyone. 2 days ago, according to publicly reported Nielsen data, a record-breaking 80 million viewers watched the televised debate between the two principal contenders for the U.S. presidency, making it the most watched presidential debate ever in American history. By way of comparison, only 67 million viewers watched the first debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney 4 years ago. As of today, there are now approximately 40 days left to the day when a new U.S. president will be elected. As one of the most interesting presidential cycles, clearly, in U.S. history winds down, perhaps like never before in history, the media is replete with nonstop news and analysis regarding the political campaigns being waged by the two principal contenders for the U.S. presidency. Coincidentally, at the same time as the U.S. presidential election season comes to a close, the 2016 proxy season, which included more than 250 campaigns by activist investors based on FactSet shark repellent data, and which is mostly concluded, will also be winding down. In this webinar, in the spirit of the election season, we're going to focus on the numerous parallels between an activist investor campaign that seeks to replace one or more members of a public company's board of directors with a political campaign such as the pending presidential election contest. Very excited to have the opportunity to moderate today's webinar. I came to Washington, D.C. more than 10 years ago as a political appointee in the Bush White House. It's pretty obvious from my accent that I am not native of Washington, D.C. But perhaps because of that background and my lifelong interest in politics, I have always believed that political campaigns, while not a perfect metaphor, are a very appropriate and easy metaphor for thinking about activist campaigns. Some of the similarities that we'll get into between an activist campaign and a political campaign are striking, as an activist campaign is often not about solving an M&A problem, but more about winning the hearts and minds of as many voting shareholders as possible and the support of key voting blocs, including those that follow the recommendations of the major proxy advisory firms. Many of the strategies and tactics followed in political and activist campaigns are very similar. Both types of campaigns, messaging, media, play significant roles, as does opposition research, third-party endorsement, vetting of candidates, ability of candidates to engage with voters or shareholders, balancing of the slate to appeal to different constituencies, a term that we've heard most recently a lot in the media, dog whistle politics, voting projections, attacks on the incumbent, calls for change, the need for rapid response teams, voter outreach, and understanding the voting blocks that are in play versus those that are committed to vote in a certain way. In addition to discussing the similarities, we'll also discuss the numerous differences between an activist investor campaign and a political campaign, as well as the numerous learning and takeaways that a political campaign provides anyone who is involved in either waging or defending an activist campaign. Our focus today is more on activist campaigns than it is on the pending election contest, and our goal is not to debate the positions or qualifications of either of the two principal candidates and add to the already extensive commentary out there on both of them. Rather, our goal today is to compare and contrast the strategies and dynamics of a political campaign with those of an activist campaign, and let you decide for yourself whether you think that political campaigns are an appropriate metaphor for thinking about activist campaigns. I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of professionals with extensive experience in activism and or political campaigns, including a number of folks I've had the honor to work with on a number of activist defense matters. Their impressive bios are included on the event website, as is their contact information, and I'm delighted that we were able to find time in their busy schedules to prepare and participate in today's discussion. Stephen Ballett, a Managing Director for Strategic Communications at FTI Consulting and head of its corporate governance and activist engagement practice. Stephen Brown, a Senior Advisor at KPMG Board Leadership Center and a leading expert on corporate governance issues and the former head of governance at TIA Kraft. Art Crozier, Chairman and co-founder of Innisfree M&A Incorporated, a leading proxy solicitation firm well known to anyone involved in the shareholder activism arena. Duncan Harrington, a Vice President, the M&A Contested Situations Practice at Credit Suisse Securities, LLC. And last but not least, Andrew Ritchie, a Vice President at Levick, a well-known, very prominent Washington, D.C.-based communication and public affairs firm. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for being with us today. Now let's start the discussion. I'm going to go first to Art Crozier. Art, what do you see as some of the key similarities between an activist campaign and a political campaign?
Well, Keith, I would say probably the primary one is that, at essence, they're both about the same question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago or a year ago in the case of an annual meeting? And, who's best placed to make things better for you? I think, one of the things that's a little bit different in an activism campaign is that are you better off is not on absolute terms, it's also on relative terms, where, you have situations like DuPont and the Trian fight, where the company had performed well, performed better than its peers, but the activist program there was, but you could do better, and we are the people who can make it better for you. So I think that underlying dynamic is basically the same between the two. It just takes various, somewhat different coloring.
And Stephen Ballett, would you agree with that? I mean, is there, in terms of some of the similarities between the activist campaign and the political campaign, that call for change, the idea to say, let's look at performance, and let's say your performance could be better, and because your performance could be better, we need to make a change?
No, absolutely. Art got it right. I mean, the fundamental part of any activist campaign and political campaign is it's always a campaign for change. There's also, if you go kind of into the weeds a little bit, there are other similarities between the two types of campaigns. There are key voting blocks. There are key constituencies or key recommendations you can get. In an activist campaign, that might mean the recommendation of a proxy advisory group like ISS or Glass Lewis. In a political campaign, that could be a key endorsement from a newspaper or a trade organization. There's get out the vote campaigns, which Art is very familiar with, where you may be doing a grassroots campaign and trying to appeal your campaign to retail shareholders, or in a political campaign to a certain type of group of shareholders. That's similar between an activist and a political campaign.
But the interesting thing, in activist campaign, it's unscheduled. I mean, people will bring an activist campaign because they think there's a lever to access that could unlock some shareholder value. A political campaign is an automatic event, right? I mean, the political campaign, whether it's Congress every 2 years, Senator every 6 years, the presidency every 4, no matter what you're going to have, no matter how good the performance is going to be of the incumbent, you're going to have a challenger.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, whereas, in the activist campaign, it just change almost for the sake of the change, even though in the DuPont case, you did have a company that was performing extremely well, and we are seeing other instances where companies performing extremely well still to be made targets. Andrew, you're our political campaign veteran. More than anyone else on this panel, you've been extensively involved in the ground game. What do you see as some of the differences between a political campaign and an activist campaign?
Yeah, I kind of want to back up what Art had said and just kind of state it in a different way, which is that, generally political campaigns fall into two different camps. They're either a referendum on the leadership or the management that you have, or they're a vision for the future that's a radical change of, a complete 180 degrees in some situations. And I think in terms of differences, that's one of the big things is to figure out which one that you're going with of those two.
And we don't have, obviously, in political campaigns, we've got parties, we've got political parties, we've got fundraising. We don't have any of that in activist campaigns. I mean,
there's not so much a need for national advertising, which means there's not so much a need for fundraising. There's some elements that are similar, but, those are two big ones that stand out. You don't have generally debates between the leader that you have and the one that you're trying to put in place. You don't have party organizations, and you don't really have to worry so much about down-ballot races as well.
Although one of the other interesting differences, I think, comes down to cash and the cost of it. One of the other distinctions in an activism situation, in a corporate situation, is that the company has the company's treasury to pay for whatever they want to do. And the shareholder who's waging this activist campaign has to fund it on his or her own. And that can lead to some real disparities in terms of amount of effort that an activist is able to put in compared to that of management. But that kind of cash differential between the two parties can be very significant in an activist campaign because of that dynamic.
In Art, that's an interesting issue because you look at in a political campaign, if you have someone who's had a House seat or a Senate seat, and there hasn't been any redistricting in a while, there are significant advantages of incumbency in terms of getting reelected, in terms of beating an insurgent. In an activist campaign, it's almost often the case that, depending on the company, and obviously the activists are pre-selecting targets that are vulnerable, the activists often has an advantage over the incumbent, and it's not just the fact that they're incumbent that gives them that huge advantage that we see in political campaigns.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that, particularly if you're talking about a situation where you don't have a lot of individual holders, but it's a primarily institutionally held shareholder base. It's not that expensive to do. If you have a lot of individual holders that you need to win their hearts and minds, that can become a very expensive process for the activist.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Keith. I think that the differential in kind of funds in an activist situation as opposed to a political campaign probably weighs more in terms of a barrier to entry, that there are many would-be activists that don't actually act on a particular company because of the cost of involvement and the benefit to them because they don't own enough shares of the stock for them to make an expense that would be relevant or worthwhile. So that's probably where the money disparity plays a bigger role than in actually, as you pointed out, activists tend to win or settle for what they want at a far greater rate than incumbents do in an activist situation.
Do we think that, I mentioned before this metaphor of a political campaign, and there's a lot of imperfections that we'll be showcasing between trying to compare one to the other, and I don't know that you can make an easy, chart side by side or slide that would say these are all the things in a political campaign that line up with some kind of analogous concept in an activist campaign. But when we talk to clients, particularly those that are new to activist campaigns, do you think it's an inappropriate metaphor, or is the metaphor too challenged?
Sure. This is Stephen Brown. This is obviously a very fun conversation given the times that we are in. But I will tell you, it's not all that far-fetched. I've taught for some time corporate governance and even lately MBAs in D.C., and for someone new to activism campaigns, it can be a little daunting. But when you compare it to something that everyone knows, which is the political campaign, they sort of get it. And by the way, folks whose job it is to either think about or legislate or to deal with regulation, those legislators in D.C., understand campaigns very well. And when you put it into that language, it becomes real. They may not all be securities lawyers, but they all are veterans of campaigns. And both these types of campaigns, political and activism, deal with substance and spin, and it just depends on the case how much of one or the other that you get. And they are both bet the company, high-stakes events, and which leads to eventually, unfortunately, many times, hyperbole, where hyperbole can obfuscate the facts, and it gets very personal. And so all of those things are involved in both campaigns. And to the uninitiated, I think this is a very good comparison because it gives them a baseline to understand some of the more intricate issues involved in shareholder activism.
Yeah, this is Andrew, and just to kind of follow up on that, when we talk about politics and political campaigns and to political science, going all the way back to the Greek, what we're talking about is the acquisition and application of power. And when we're talking about political campaigns, normally we're talking about affairs of the state or affairs of the federal government or whatever. But that same acquisition and application of power, I think, transfers over into shareholder activism campaigns in a lot of ways.
We talk about with some of the advisors that you see in a political campaign. It's a feeding frenzy. There's the consultants, there's the strategists, the pollsters, media buyers, messaging gurus, election lawyers, on and on. Is there any overlap between that the advisors that are used in a political campaign and the advisors that are used in activist campaigns? Stephen?
Yeah, sure. So we're an advisor that's sometimes used in both. One of the areas where we see some overlap is in polling or perception work. We tend to do a lot of perception work for company clients where they go out and anonymously poll their shareholders to find out what are the issues that are most relevant to them so that should they be faced with an activist campaign in the future, they will know the trigger points and the issues that they can lever to their advantage within that campaign. It's a similar method that's used in polling for political campaigns. Once again, prior to a campaign beginning, understanding the thoughts and views of your shareholders so you can of your constituents, so you can shape your message around those views.
And Stephen Ballard, you're talking about perception studies.
Yeah, perception studies for companies or regular polling. If it's for a political campaign, they're pretty close to the same thing.
And so we're drawing another analogy, which is that we don't necessarily have polling in activist campaigns, but in both cases, there are folks, depending on the size of the company and how much money they want to spend, who are going to go out to the investors, shareholders, voters, etc., as the case may be, and are going to say, what are the concerns, the bread and butter issues that you're concerned with, because you want to know that in order to run an effective campaign.
Right, and it's very important in terms of, and I think this is another place where I guess the political and activists are a little bit analogous, more so now than they were 5 years ago, in that many companies are starting to prepare for the possibility of a campaign. I think it was mentioned by one of the other contributors earlier that, we don't necessarily have an activist campaign every year at a company, but it's becoming a phenomenon that's happening more and more often. So as companies prepare, they want to know what the issues are, the hot button issues that their shareholders may want to hear more about or may need to be pay more attention to, so that an activist can't come in and target that company. So we're doing more and more of that type of work, which is the same type of thing that goes on, I believe, in the political sphere.
Sorry, Pershing. I mean, I think another place where there's overlap is communications. A little bit different, I think, in an activist campaign because, generally speaking, the communications are very targeted down to directly into the actual holders of the stock, building up on the kind of information that Steve was talking about before in terms of perception studies and, understanding on a very granular basis the elements of the shareholder base, roles of proxy advisory firms on which institutions and so on and so forth. But crafting those written communications that go directly to those holders with the right messaging for the whole shareholder base, because it needs to be consistent. But also, particularly in high-profile situations, also the media. Most proxy fights, most activism situations don't get a lot of coverage, but in the media. But in high-profile ones, they certainly do. And it's important like a political campaign, it's important to try to win each news cycle in those circumstances so that narratives don't get established that it's going to be very hard to overcome in persuading people to support you at the ballot box.
Keith, this is Duncan. Following up on one of the things that Steve was talking about earlier, and I think someone else mentioned about companies looking in advance at their potential vulnerability to an activist attack and what their getting a sense of what their shareholders are thinking. One difference I was kind of thinking of between the role of a political advisor and an advisor in an activist context is it seems like the political advisor more might help sort of hone or polish or kind of package a candidate's message or sort of give it kind of technical and tactical advice on how to use that message to win the vote. But they probably don't seem to this might be more my inexperience with what goes on behind the scenes in political campaigns, but it seems like they don't do as much shaping the candidate's platform itself or the key tenets of their platform, whereas it seems like in the activism context, particularly in some of this proactive thinking that companies are starting to do today, where they're thinking about where are there brush fires with our shareholder base, where are there self-help steps we could make to preempt an activist attack, whether it's governance changes or strategic. That it seems like that in that way that the actual advisors in the shareholder context can actually help a company assess what their strategy is versus a potential or even a live activist thesis, and think about what potential strategic changes they might want to take, whether it's in advance or in response. So it could actually have a significant change on the direction of a company or the way that they actually engage with shareholders and et cetera.
Duncan, I want to follow up on that point because it's a good segue to a very important issue, which is, when we looked at these debates 2 days ago, a number of times during debates we had the candidates refer the viewers to their websites and all the policies that are on their websites, and I haven't spent a lot of time on either candidate's websites, but, I understand there's extensive discussion on where they stand on various policy issues that some team had to be retained to spend hours and hours preparing and doing, and they've hired advisors, economic policy, everything you could think of in terms of how we're going to create jobs and tax policy, et cetera. But then we get to an activist campaign, and this is where I think a lot of companies are challenged, is that you really need to do the same thing, and you need to be able to articulate thoughtful, nuanced positions on some complicated, let's say, policy issues. In shareholder speak, they would be how to get the stock price up, right? And they don't always companies aren't always willing to spend the time or the money to do that. Isn't that really the role of an investment bank? That's one of the key reasons in an activist defense you would bring an investment banker on, because somebody has to help you come up with thoughtful, nuanced positions on how we're going to get that stock price up.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, for a lot of our clients who we advise who don't have a live activist situation but just want to be prepared or proactive thinking about it, I think, one of the things we tell them is, in a way, sort of be your own activist, so to speak. So take, an honest assessment of your own company, your strategy, the direction you're going in, the feedback you're getting from your shareholders, and that's really kind of a core tenet of what the financial advisor's role and business model is. And I think you sort of hit on two parts of it. I think first thing is, the financial advisor, the banker, is going to know the company and the sector and should be able to give, a third-party sort of enhanced review of a company's strategic plan versus, say, an activist thesis or versus certain other alternatives, and make kind of a recommendation about a best path forward for maximizing shareholder value. So I think the first part is that kind of what I was mentioning before about the banker can help a company formulate what that strategy or message actually is. And then the second part of that, which is what I think you were just sort of talking about, is I think gets more to the question of that the financial advisor is also going to know the markets and the investors and the company's different shareholder constituencies and how they think and what they care about, and therefore can help you convey in the most coherent way what the rationale for a certain for the company strategy versus, say, a dissident strategy to provide what are the proof points to demonstrate progress or what are the milestones you've accomplished, articulate counter-arguments to, for example, an activist demands that don't make sense. And this can all be kind of synthesized in either the form of like an investor presentation or talking points in a live activist campaign in a proxy fight scenario, talking points for meetings with ISS and key investors or what questions you're likely to be asked and things like that. So I think in a way this sort of being this kind of bridge to the buy side, so to speak, is, like you were saying, Keith, that probably one of the most critical components of success in a proxy fight that a financial advisor addresses, and kind of a key part of what sort of my team sort of does on a day in and day out basis.
Right, because at the end of the day, when we think of the policy advisor, what's the analogous, role to someone who's a policy advisor for a campaign? I mean, while FDI can sell that, and Art Crozier and his team at Innisfree could help get in front of the right stockholders to get that message. The idea is, what is the right policy? What is the right path forward? And that's where really I think the banker's role comes in and is often, in many cases, unduly neglected because people are not realizing that they do need to have a policy if they're going to win the fight.
Absolutely, and I think having a third-party assessment and sort of an advisor who can give an unvarnished opinion of what they think of one path versus alternatives, it gives a company a fresh perspective, whether it's validating their current strategy, thinking about modifying it, looking at some sort of a compromise with a dissident, and I think that really helps the potential target company think through some of these very complicated issues in advance.
Just to add on to what has been said, this is Stephen Brown. Having excellent advisors is absolutely key to give the board and management the information that they need to state their case. But I always go back. I mean, I spend a lot of time with boards and boards effectiveness at the board leadership center at KPMG, and we always like to walk down with boards why they need to spend the time in talking to management about their activist defense and thinking like an activist and preparing, even if they don't smell any, there's no blood in the water for them. It's because the only natural predator to a board member is a shareholder. They're the only ones with the right to vote you out, and they will do so, and they have done so more and more over the last 5 years, the last decade, than they've done in the previous 5 years, the previous decade. There's more of a willingness there. Part of that's pushed by hedge fund activists having more campaigns, but these events are usually happening in crisis, and one of the top three issues when you talk to boards what do you wish you had more time, at your board meetings? They always point to one thing, and it's strategy. And the flip side to that is, activists come in after spending 6 months, looking at strategy. That's something which you didn't do, which is why, their arguments can be a lot more persuasive to the shareholder base if the board can't articulate a strategy going forward, and this is usually our emphasis to get them to really focus more on strategy and build it into their annual agenda because their jobs depend on it.
Yeah, this is Art Crozier. I mean, and I think to feed off that point, again, in terms of the difference between political campaigns and activism campaigns, the structure at a corporation, I think, is very different from anything you'll see in a political campaign in the sense that the real target, if in an activism situation, in a proxy fight, is the board of directors. And that's the shareholders voting on the board of directors. And in too many instances, the board does not know what the shareholders think, what the shareholders believe. And that's why it's really very important for the bankers, the perception studies, and that Steve mentioned before, and any other information that can go, that there's a process that the boards have the ability to really get down and understand what their shareholders are thinking. Because too many people in these activism campaigns, the directors just get blindsided because they're just not aware of what the real issues are that the shareholders are really concerned about.
This is Stephen Ballot, and to add to that, and many of us on the call have been involved in a lot of situations, there are some really good boards that have considered exactly what the activists might be proposing and have decided to go a different way. But oftentimes it's very difficult for boards to actually communicate the process that is actually going on in the boardroom to shareholders. So shareholders only understand what the final decision the company has made is. They don't understand that the company has thought of, considered in a very thoughtful and had a robust debate on other paths, but after all of that consideration, decided on the path and the strategy that they're going with. And what we find is that when shareholders are aware that there is a good process in the boardroom, they will tend to support boards, even if they end up disagreeing with the path the board has gone on. They want to know that there was a good and thoughtful process in the boardroom in arriving at decisions.
And so, Stephen Ballard, you're really talking about transparency, that there's not enough transparency from the boardroom to shareholders as to what paths have been taken to enhance shareholder value. I mean, and a number of us have worked together well into late hours on investor decks before the ISS meeting, and all this has got to get fleshed out into the deck for the first time. That it was never there before, even though there was steps that were taken that shareholders are surprised to learn were taken.
And that really needs, but Keith, that really needs to be done a lot earlier, first time at least than ISS, and this may be an area where there's elements of a political campaign that are coming into, corporate activism situations, or not even activism situations, but what's fairly customary, I believe, in the political world. Politicians go out on town halls to listen to what their constituents are saying, and they can bring that back to whatever their role is. And increasingly, what we're seeing among corporates is not open town halls, because nobody really wants to do an uncontrolled situation, but engagement with the shareholders, including engagement that involves directors of the company, talking to and listening to their shareholders and bringing that back to the boardroom.
This is Andrew. I want to kind of echo that point. And, as a political guy, one of the biggest problems, and this, may be a real weakness, is, I think it was 3 or 4 comments ago, I think it was Art said in too many instances the board of directors don't know what shareholders think or believe. And that is such a huge thing in the campaign world is, one of the biggest ways that you can really do a lot of damage to your opponent is paint them as aloof or unresponsive. And so that may be one thing that boards of directors can do to shore up, to make sure that they look responsive and look like they're listening. I'll call it, for lack of a better term, the Saturday Night Live effect. However a candidate's portrayed on Saturday Night Live can really impact how they perform when it comes time for the election. And, you look at how Saturday Night Live portrayed Gerald Ford, you look at how they portrayed Al Gore, and you look at how they're portrayed Sarah Palin and such, all of the candidates. And, that really resonates with, it's a caricature, but it resonates with voters when the time comes.
That's almost why, this is Duncan, by the way, that's why I sort of like the term, what Art was saying, engagement versus just transparency, because in engagement, you're not just communicating with the shareholders, but you're also listening to what they're saying back, and that feedback, you have to show to the shareholders that you're listening, you hear it, and you take that on board, because a lot of times you might not agree with everything every shareholder says, but the fact that you're listening and trying to assimilate that as much as you can, I think, will mean a lot, especially if it's done earlier on before an activist situation comes up, where that, in that case, the board and the management gets full credit for it, rather than happening when they feel, the threat of an activist attack, where it's something that looks, reactive to some threat that's been imposed upon them.
Exactly. This is Andrew again, and one of the biggest things that, I think comes from the political world that could transfer over is this idea of grassroots. And in a lot of ways, people get grassroots wrong in what they think that grassroots organizing is, and that they think that grassroots is changing people's minds about an issue. But what really grassroots is putting a goalpost in the ground and taking all the people that you know are already on your side and directing them to run towards that goalpost. And in a political campaign, you will have months and months and months of field operations, which are just calling voters and trying to figure out where they are on the spectrum of support. And then, if you're a strong supporter, okay, we're not going to spend as much resources on you, but we're going to make sure that you turn out on Election Day. If you're undecided, we're going to try to move you towards the support column. If you're a strong opponent, unless you really need them to get to that number, you're not going to spend a lot of time on them either.
And then in terms of organizing, and that's a great analogy, Andrew, because when we look at activist campaigns, when a client calls me up and early on and says, we just saw this 13F filed, and there's this activist coming to our stock, what should we do? Well, from the lawyer's side, there isn't really much that we need to do. What I always tell them the first call is, do you have a good proxy solicitor? Retain a proxy solicitor, because we need to start looking at your shareholder base, and we need to start having a strategy for being able to go out and talk to your shareholders really in listen mode and figure out what do they know, what are their issues, and has anyone else been out there to see them? Because they may not tell you, but from the nature of the issues that they raise, that might give you the intelligence that someone else is out there quietly trying to run a ground game ahead of you. And that's why getting a good proxy solicitor, like Art Shop, involved early, quietly to go out and help you look at who's going to talk to me, who do you know there that'll talk to me, and what meetings would be the most effective strategy for me to pursue early on.
Well, thank you for that, Keith.
Art, would you agree with that?
And hopefully they've done that as a routine and early in advance. I think in 2016, for companies to be surprised that they should have an annual and routine shareholder outreach, particularly institutional shareholder outreach campaign of their top 10 investors. And all of you on the phone have had this conversation with your clients, I know for sure, but they sort of look at you funny saying, well, why should we have to do that? And then you have to spend another hour walking them through why it makes sense. And similarly to a long-term incumbent who doesn't take care of his constituents and at least showing his face or her face from time to time and going to weddings and picking up babies and walking the streets and knocking on doors. If you don't do that, come at crisis time, and I think someone said it, Duncan said it earlier, you don't get the credit because you're just responding because you're in a crisis. One of the interesting parallels, in campaigns, you have embedded journalists. So both of these current campaigns, they have journalists who've been there, and their work will be embargoed. They cannot publish until the campaign is over, and then they usually publish a piece talking about what happened in the campaign. And usually you see there's absolute dysfunction in one and almost perfection in the other. But you can't see that until after the election because they're sort of they're embargoed from publishing. But there's a similarity when you sort of do case studies and you look at activist campaigns and you look at what board members have said when they've lost these votes, where the shareholders did not understand us and they couldn't get this point and that point. The tie was just against us because the activists basically either lied or he took something we were already doing and claimed it as his own idea, which is all of that comes down to really, I think, a problem with the board and management in getting the messaging wrong and not having a full-fledged engagement plan where you're able from year in and year out to tell your story to your key shareholders so that when it comes to crisis, they understand that you're not coming to them in crisis, and the story that you were telling them is the story that you've told them previous quarters ago.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, Stephen. And to put a bit of a finer point on it, and this is something I would, up until this presidential campaign, I would have said that this is the same in a political campaign as it is in a shareholder activism situation, but particularly if you are representing an issuer, the most important thing, the most critical important thing that the issuer has to have is credibility. Credibility with the shareholders. And that is not something that you can start to build when the proxy statement is mailed for the contested meeting or even when the 13D is filed. It has to start early, and it's best done on a clear day. When no one is out there, no one is raising issues, you're building that credibility, you're explaining what you're doing, why you're doing, how you're going about it. And if you manage that and people believe what you're saying, that is going to pay off immensely in potentially holding off an activist situation in the very first place. Or if you do get into one, diffusing it early or quite possibly, ultimately winning in the proxy fight.
As the author Harvey McKay once said, dig your well before you're thirsty.
Right.
Yeah. And so I guess we're getting into some of the factors, success and failure factors for, common to both a activist campaign and a political campaign. Let's deal with success factors first. What would we regard as some of the success factors that are common to both? Understanding that the current year's election cycle may not be the best model as to what that means, but in a normal situation, in a normal comparison between an election campaign and an activist campaign, what would we regard as some of the common success factors? I mean, maybe we'll go to first our political expert, Andrew. What do you see as some of the factors that really, in the campaigns you've been involved in, have been successful? What have been those key factors?
So I think the biggest one is obviously getting to the 50% plus one number that you kind of lay out at the very beginning and doing it in a way that leaves you as undamaged as possible. Obviously, the bigger margin that you have, the more of a mandate you have when it comes time to govern. But, at the very beginning, you lay out, okay, here's the voters in the district, and the amount of data that campaign organizations have now is so immense and it's so sophisticated. When I was doing field work in 2008, we have, and every state has this type of a system where they can go in, they can see which elections you voted in, what your political party registration is, and they can build a really targeted list of of people. If they don't know where you are, they use words like 4x4, 2x4. So if you voted in all 4 of the last 4 elections, you're a registered Democrat, you show up, or a registered Republican, when they call you, you say that you're a strong supporter, they're not going to worry about you because you vote all the time. And so they'll count you as as part of that 50% plus one number. And then it's figuring out what the delta is between the number of voters that you have that are likely to vote and likely on your side and what your persuadable audience is. And getting, enough of your persuadable audience to go out on election day and cast their vote in your favor is really, where a lot of the difference is made. And that's why a strong ground game is so important.
And that's where I come back to the role of the proxy solicitor, because it's that proxy solicitor who's going to be able to help you look at when they do a vote projection and look at your current shareholder profile, or in an activist campaign, your evolving shareholder profile, because let's remember the record date might be set months and months after the activist shows up, and it's that proxy solicitor that has the experience of knowing these are the voters that we could swing, and these are the ones who are going to be lost. These are the ones that are going to vote with ISS, Glass Lewis, Egan-Jones, etc. And being able to start that ground game very early as possible. I assume you would agree with that.
Yeah, I think I would, Keith. Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely true. I mean, it's a lot easier, I think, in that respect, from a political situation, in the sense that on the institutional side, we have public filings, we have some other information that we can look at that gives us a very good handle on the institutional holders of the stock, and can categorize them, as you say, the institutions that would follow one of the advisory services and run out vote scenarios, assuming which way ISS goes. What does that mean for what other elements of the shareholder base that you have to have in order to win? And again, you can plot that out on the institutional side fairly easily. You know who they are. You can access a lot of their voting records from what they've done in the past. You're in regular communication with them, so you know how they think about things. You can figure out their investment thesis and how that's going to play out into the decision. And then something of the wild card are the individual holders who, again, from an issuer's perspective, unless a company is genuinely in extremis, are going to support management, by no less than usually a ratio of 65-35 running management. The harder part is getting them to vote. But again, you know who they are, and you can, conduct a direct mail campaign and telephone calls to bring out the level of participation that your vote scenarios say you need from that constituency in order to win.
Keith, this is Duncan, but that makes me think about, one other key difference from an activist campaign versus a political campaign is that in the activist context, the demographics and the breakdown of the voters can change dramatically from the time the campaign is launched until the record date, meaning you can, the turnover in the shareholder base to, say, the more fast money type investors who may buy into the stock expecting something to happen can have a big impact on how the proxy solicitor might, project the vote outcome to be, or what the strategy might be to try to win the vote, or whether to settle prior to a vote. I mean, let's not forget that about 75% or more of activist campaigns settle well in advance of the vote. So that change in the shareholder base, or it's actually just the change of the demographics of your voters, can have a significant impact on what a company decides to do to, rebut or respond to an activist threat.
It's like you're a political candidate, and you've declared your candidacy, and while you're a candidate, your district keeps getting redistricted on a constant basis until Election Day.
Right.
Right, but one of the differences, I mean, that's all exactly right. But one of the differences too is that, again, particularly if you're an issuer, you can make that happen to your advantage to a certain extent. Again, if you've got enough advance notice, which is to say, you're doing an engagement program, your shareholders are just not getting the story, and they don't understand what you're doing. You can then undertake a targeting program and bring new shareholders into the base who understand what you're trying to do, and that will fit into their investment thesis. And I guess it's kind of like redistricting, again, use those kinds of tools to get a more favorable shareholder base.
Yep. Yeah, I've definitely been involved in a number of situations where, by bringing in a new key cornerstone investor, a name that other people recognize, someone who believes in the management and the story, is a huge. Not only is it a signal to the other side that there's a significant voting contingent that's going to be probably against them, but to the other shareholders, it's a huge public vote of confidence in the management and the company story.
Yep, like white hats or white squire type investments.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And also, Keith, this is Steve Ballot. You're not limited in terms of country or jurisdiction. We've worked with a lot of companies bringing in European shareholders, particularly for companies in the United States which offer a dividend, which tend to be much more supportive or long-term shareholders than some of the U.S. shareholders. So once again, it goes to what Art and Duncan were saying. Companies do have the luxury of trying to change their shareholder base in order to make it more favorable to a long-term strategy, just as activists, by bringing up the possibility of a sale or a split or a spin-off of the company, try to bring in more of the short-term focused shareholders into the company base to support their agenda.
And Stephen, that's an interesting point because it raises another kind of tool the companies have in their arsenal, which is, you look at the current political campaign, and if I was Hillary Clinton or the Democratic Party, I would want to have been able to move Election Day from November until right after the Democratic convention, right after they left Philadelphia. If I was them and there was the opportunity to have Election Day, let's say before Labor Day, that would have been great, right? It would, and I think we know how the vote would have turned out there based on the polls that were around at that time. Companies do have a certain amount of luxury to move Election Day, in that the meeting, maybe they have their annual meeting April, but there is some on a typical basis for maybe one company, but they have the ability to move that date and shift the date because maybe they're going to have a great earnings quarter and they want to get that earnings news out there before shareholders. You don't have the ability to do that in an election campaign. I mean, isn't that one of the big advantages the company has, control of the calendar?
Yeah, I mean, although you can't run too far because then you look like you're defensive, but it also cuts the other way in the sense of company looks and says, okay, we're in good shape. We have an annual meeting, and it's going to be next April, and we have all these great things we can do between now and next April. But if that company also has provisions that permit the shareholder to call a special meeting or act by written consent, they've lost that control over the calendar.
Absolutely. What do we think of some of the causes of failure in that common both political campaign and activist campaign? I mean, one that comes to mind right away is, not following the teleprompter or going off message. But there are a number of things that I think people have already touched on in terms of things that are likely to result in a failed campaign. Maybe we'll go to Andrew.
Yeah, so, a couple of things that come to mind. I think going off message, absolutely is one of the biggest things. We talked earlier about the teams of people who are issue advisors. Some of it comes from the candidate's own beliefs. Some of it comes from polling. You know exactly what issues are important to your district or to your electorate, and you know exactly how to say them and how to position them and how to convey your position on there. So going off message, if you do that, that's huge, and that can be a really detrimental and devastating thing. A failure to shore up your support, failure to have a strong ground game, a failure to have a really effective get-out-the-vote program, which includes now as more and more states are doing early voting and vote by mail, that's such a huge thing for organizations is to get people, so the less people you have to worry about on Election Day because you have 3 weeks, a month, varies state to state, that's obviously a big thing. And the third point that I think is really important, and this goes back to something we were talking about a couple minutes ago, is this idea of endorsements and coalition building. Just like a person who comes on board with a company or with an activist investor can persuade a significant block of voters, the same thing can happen with third-party groups. And people always ask, why do candidates spend so much time pursuing the endorsement of the NRA, the Chamber of Commerce, the Sierra Club? I mean, there's so many different groups that get so targeted on what their issues are. The American Heart Association, or there's groups with really niche issues, but they control voters. And with every issue, there's a contingent, sometimes small, sometimes large, of people who are single issue voters or who will really take the position of that organization into effect whenever they go to vote. And so getting the endorsement of the NRA, for example, is huge for candidates because a lot of people, the NRA has a really strong activation and grassroots program where they'll get people to the polls, but also, people will only vote for candidates. There are a lot of people who will only vote for candidates if they are endorsed by a group that they care about.
And likewise, in activist campaigns, we all know the endorsement of the major proxy advisory firms is key. And again, going back to the idea of bringing a solicitor in early, I think that the proxy solicitor can tell you very early on, very quickly, how important it's going to be, how dispositive it is to get the proxy solicitor involved early on, and I think that's why when in most of the defenses that we've all been involved in, we spend countless hours, right? I mean, preparing the clients for the ISS meetings, and spending 8 to 10 hours in a room with the client, really understanding what it is what's the messaging and what is the going through the deck and what else needs to be in the deck because of how important it is to win that endorsement.
Well, and with respect to ISS and also to Glass Lewis, I mean, it's also very important to get endorsers to call the endorser. In other words, have, particularly shareholders who are clients of the advisory firm who are supportive of your position, to reach out to ISS and Glass Lewis and express support so that they are hearing directly from shareholders as to what the shareholders' view is. And, similarly with sell-side analysts that try to get good sell-side analyst reports that support your position, and ideally get them to call ISS. A lot of institutions and ISS will be very supportive, but will not want to go public with that endorsement in a public way. But they are willing, oftentimes, to make calls to the advisory firms and often also to other key shareholders.
I absolutely agree. This is Stephen Brown. There's also something to be said, which is sort of stating the obvious about likability and trust in both types of campaign, political and activist campaign. Voters have to like you, and proxy voters have to do the same, particularly if you're in a contested election and they're going to meet management and the board, hopefully, as well as the activists. And and there are activists, and just going back to my days at the institution, as an institutional investor, who I didn't particularly care for. If they were making a strong argument, then they made a strong argument, and that wins the day. But in these close ones, likability matters, particularly because in the minds of portfolio managers, many portfolio managers, not all, when you have a contest for a couple board seats or short slate as opposed to the entire board, you have a lot of PMs who will say, well, I like the CEO. I like management. Performance has been down, but I like the guy. It can't hurt, giving 2 board seats to the activists. It's not a majority. It's not control. In their minds, it can't hurt. It can only help. But of course, we know that even a minority of board seats and changing that complexion of the board can have serious ramifications. But many people think that ramification is actually positive. So it really does matter, who you send out to talk to the portfolio managers and those who are casting proxy votes, and what their message is. Not everyone who has the senior position is good at making this type of sale. That's probably why they weren't hired to do shareholder engagement. They were hired from some other skill. But in this day and age, this is a skill that you have to be 100% successful at.
Yeah, and I think, Stephen, that underlines one of the other really key differences between a political campaign and director contests, as they're mostly waged. In a political campaign, it's binary. You're in or you're out. In a corporate election, it's the members of the board who are up, and people can make a selection that says, well, it's a 9-member board. What the hell? Let me put 2 activists on. And I think that leads to, your point about likability, credibility, that in a corporate context, those 2 qualities, likability, credibility, are very asymmetric compared to the dissident. In other words, on credibility, likability, the issuer, to have a full sweep win, has to bowl everybody over and say all of our guys are absolutely stupendous, and I couldn't possibly do without any of them looking at it as a shareholder. Whereas the shareholder just has to say, let's just get some fresh blood on the board. You don't necessarily need to really like all of our guys. Maybe you like 1, maybe you like 2. We don't have to prove that our ideas about the company are absolutely right. We just want to be your representatives in the board and make sure they're doing the right thing. So it's, and I think that's a large part of the reason why most of the corporate campaigns wind up in a settlement, because there is this very asymmetric challenge between the management and the dissident shareholder.
And so, Art, to follow up on that, when we think of political campaigns, a political party, particularly if it's a congressional race or a Senate race, they think there's a long-time incumbent that's going to be vulnerable. They may go out and they may recruit a candidate from central casting who they think, could win that seat. When we think of directors that are standing for election in a contested campaign, historically, even to this day with all the activist campaign activity, most directors are not selected for their ability to be able to be a candidate in a contested election. So then my question going into success factors, how important is it, because of the desire for fresh blood early on, to start thinking about reshaping the candidate slate from the company side and getting people who are going to be, to Stephen Brown's point, more likable that we could put in front of investors and say, hey, we you don't need the activist fresh blood. We've provided fresh blood, and look at this superstar we've recruited.
Yeah. No, I think that, and you see a lot of issuers do that, and a lot of it isn't about, a lot of the choice is not about likability of the director per se, but quite honestly, it's about how long has the director been on the board. And you'll see companies easing, if they know they're facing a likely proxy fight, easing off the board the longer tenured members to bring in some new folks with track records and credibility, et cetera, built in. Because again, in a short slate contest, which is what most of the director contests are, the activist basically gets to pick which of the incumbent directors they are going to run against. And 99 out of 100 times, the ones they pick are the ones with the longest tenure on the board, because that's like the easiest case to make for fresh blood, new ideas, etc.
Hi, Keith. Steve Balley here, and I agree with Art. I think that just as in a political situation, if your opponent has already stated that they're running against you, or an activist has stated that they're in the stock and they want change, and you start to make that board movement, then what the activist will do and what a political opponent will do is take credit for your changes. They will say that the only reason why you're conducting this board transition now, or the only reason why you've changed your view on some issue, is because of them. So it would behoove boards that are thinking that they may possibly be a target in the future to begin making those board changes now. Because when you make them in the context of an activist situation, and we've seen this with a lot of companies. I think there was a company where there's a rumored settlement today where a board makes changes, brings on new independent directors, and the activist still gets 3 or 4 seats on the board, and now you have almost a completely changed board instead of being able to have worked that out earlier and prevent the activist interest in the stock.
Yeah,
this is Andrew. One of the biggest jobs of a political consultant and a communications consultant on a campaign is to get in front of exactly those types of issues. And if you're going to make a change, throughout your campaign structure or on an issue or whatever, make sure that you're not doing it in a way that allows your opponent to claim a victory. Because one of the biggest things an opponent can do is claim victory, and then they hammer that point every chance that they get and show that you are weak or you're flip-flopping, and that you are not necessarily the candidate that they want to move forward with.
Yeah, no, and it's not just about changing out directors. I mean, we've seen it's almost anything that the company does after an activist rears his or her head. No matter how long it may have been in development or under discussion, to the extent that it's announced after the activist shows up, the activist is going to take credit for it and say, this is the reason why you need to put me on the board. I'm the reason this happened. It's the only reason why it happened. I will continue to force change. And it's a tough argument to battle against, again, if you haven't built that credibility up beforehand.
So I think everyone agrees.
How tenures become such a hot button issue with a lot of, some more governance focused investors that board members who've been on for a certain number of years are viewed more as being kind of, insiders versus outsiders, which I guess is kind of analogous to a theme you sometimes hear in political elections, sometimes being sort of a Washington insider versus a honest outsider who's going to give a fresh perspective. That's, part of the fact that that's become such a hot button issue is one of the reasons why I think it helps for an activist to say, look, you need someone in there, fresh blood in there, who's going to be the shareholder watchdog, who's going to keep these guys honest. And I think it really helps get a lot of traction early on for some of the more governance-focused investors who don't really know as much about the company, may not even have much of a dialogue with the company or talk to them before an activist situation comes up. But it's just one of sort of the kind of, causes du jour that they, care about and is important to them. And it's going to, strike a chord with them when an activist kind of tries to pull that lever with them.
But even though, the activists could claim that all these changes were because they came into the stock as a strategy, given the situation you find yourself in where the company did not do all the things that we're talking about they should have done, don't we all think they should still do them anyhow? Did not do them?
Oh, yeah, no, I think so. But, again, people just, the board in particular, shouldn't come away with the view that this is a magic elixir that will, make the activists disappear and all things will be wonderful again. It can be used against you, and you have to be prepared for that, and you have to be willing to just keep on the message and keep moving and making the case that this is a long-term part of a long-term plan and strategy to drive value for the shareholders.
And that's where the communication professionals, I think, really add a lot of value because, this is something they've done over and over again is deal with this issue in proxy fights. Stephen Ballard, I know you deal with this issue all the time because there is window dressing that happens or there is stuff that's reactive, and being able to appropriately position that is something that you do on a daily basis. Is not something you're doing for the first time in terms of how to respond to that.
Exactly. When it comes to the media and when it comes to other areas that you're going to be putting out messaging, when it comes to the media, you want to be able to background the media on all the steps the boards have taken, and you want to what we like to call be able to show your work. Show the path the board has been on and where it's taking the company in the future. It is difficult, as Art says. Once an activist is in the stock, particularly the media, tends to give the activist credit for anything that the company does. So what we try to do with companies, and once again, I think it's a pretty well-discussed theme on this call, is before an activist gets into a stock, start talking to your stakeholders as well as your investors, which means create your media contacts and your relationships with them. And also do the same for your government officials. Make sure that you've reached out and have a relationship with the governor of your state, with your various representatives in D.C., with the mayor of the town where your headquarters are in. You would be surprised at the value that these individuals can bring in an activist situation, particularly if an activist is calling for the sale of a company or a spinoff of the company or something where it may have to go through a regulatory process. By having those government officials involved and being able to make supportive statements possibly on behalf of the company, it may not stop the activist attack, but what it may do is prevent, I think Art and a few others brought it up earlier, supportive shareholders of the activist agenda from entering the stock because they may have doubts as to whether that agenda by the activist can be successful.
And so, Steve Ballard, you're saying, and I don't think it's every situation, but I think I've been involved in a number where I think a public affairs strategy definitely makes sense, particularly if you're defending a company in a town where they are the dominant employer, and you might be in a small state where the senator takes the calls of the CFO or the CEO fairly quickly, and so you need to have a public affairs strategy, and that's either your firm or Andrew's firm that's got a lot of experience in that area.
Yeah, but it's something that you also, I think, you have to tread carefully on for two reasons. I think one, some level when you're using endorsers who are not shareholders, you are raising up the question of, is this really about shareholder value or is it about something else? And because this guy is not a shareholder, is he really doing this for my interest as a shareholder, or is he doing it for other reasons? And I think the other thing that we're always just a little bit leery about is how far you really go in those governmental relations type issues, because to the extent that institutions in particular feel that you are trying to stack the deck politically, it pisses them off enormously and can really backfire on you.
Absolutely, it needs to be done delicately, but what we like our companies to do is at least establish the relationship so that they can pull on those levers should they need to at the time. Just as with anything, just as with investors, unless you've established a relationship with your investor, unless you've established a relationship with the media or with government officials, you don't really have the optionality of using them should it be needed in a certain situation.
Yeah, and I think a number of us have been involved in situations, including working together, where our advice to the client was not to bring in the political heavyweight, kind of keep them on ice, but maybe access them later on, but that there was more downside than upside in having them be publicly and actively involved in the situation. In the current presidential election, we're seeing social media play an incredibly important role, more than any other time in history. And if you weren't a Twitter addict prior to the presidential election, I mean, you could easily go to the gym, spend an hour on the Stairmaster, just going through the latest on Twitter on the current election. It's quite fascinating. Social media. Are we seeing social media play a significant role in activist campaigns, or are the regulatory challenges, which are not hard to overcome, but need to be addressed? Do we think that is too much of an impediment to really make wide use of social media for an activist campaign?
This is Art Crozier again. I mean, we're not crazy about social media in a proxy fight, certainly, because I think one of the other key differences between an electoral campaign and a corporate campaign is that in order for a shareholder to participate, they have to have a proxy card in front of them, whether they're going to vote through the mail, they're going to vote electronically, they're going to vote by a telephone call. They have to have a proxy card in front of them that gives this particular ID number that they need in order to cast a valid vote. And there is a real level of exhaustion. I mean, again, corporate campaigns don't have the same sense of obligation about them, the same level of kind of like public discourse that everybody gets very involved with and wants to be engaged with. And so we're very concerned about the exhaustion element that can set in through extensive use of social media. In other words, that by the time that proxy card gets into their hands in the mail, whether it's the initial mailing or subsequent mailings, if they've already been bombarded with social media messages that can't contain that critical ID number that's necessary for them to vote, by the time that proxy card gets into their hands in their mailbox, they've already said, oh, for God's sakes, another communication about XYZ Corp. I'll get to it later. I'm sick. I'm tired. I don't want to hear anymore.
I agree with that. Steve Ballot, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I do agree with Art that the proactive social media approach has some negatives. I think what we normally recommend for clients is taking more of a repository of information approach, creating a microsite so everything that you've put out can be referenced to and you can guide your shareholders, the media, other interested parties to that area so they can get a hold of all of your information in one place. Although, listen, it's all about the votes in the end, but from a corporate point of view, they also have to run a company. And what happens is there's a lot of back and forth in the media from the activists criticizing the company that filters down to employees, particularly when an activist is calling for a major change at that company, such as a split or a sale of a division or a sale of the whole company. So it's important for the companies to have a resource that employees can go to track the responses the company's making and to show that the company is fighting for them as well. So I agree with Art. The constant bombardment with messages has a wearying effect on voters, and that's who we need. But to have some place for everyone to go to be able to guide them to get the information is probably a good idea on the company side, and we see activists using that as well.
Yeah, no, we love microsites, and one of the things that's great about a microsite that people, I think, are trying to do more and more, although it's very hard to do, is if you've got the right messenger to put a video up on the website. Ideally it's the CEO, the chairman, or whatever that has, a kind of short but very punchy, very direct, very compelling message that people can actually see on their screen. That can be very impactful both on the individual retail holders and I also believe on the institutional side for some of the smaller institutions who may never get to see or talk to the principals in the fight. So yeah, no, we love microsites, and we particularly like those videos if we can get something put together that's very strong and compelling.
This is Andrew, and from in politics and in all of my other corporate work, microsites are absolutely one of those things that you have to have. But I almost wonder if digitally now the targeting and data has become so sophisticated that, for example, a video like you're talking about can be targeted to such a person, the level of the individual, if needed. Whether on Facebook, on Twitter, you can upload a list of exactly who you want to reach and just kind of force that information in front of them through their social feeds. And so that's a tactic that I think campaigns are getting a lot more sophisticated with, in terms of, before it was just they would target groups or people of a certain interest, but now it's getting to the point where they can target specific voters with their messaging.
Yeah, no, we've talked to a big data firm, and what can be done is absolutely mind-boggling.
And just on the microsite issue, I mean, the regulatory issues today are easily addressed. Filing it as additional soliciting material, all the web shots, that's extremely easy to do, and it's easy to keep up with it. It used to be more of a challenge some years back. But it has not been a challenge in at least over the past 2 years, and the SEC I have not gotten any pushback, any of my situations from the SEC on how we're addressing the filing of the materials that are posted to the microsite. So it's that issue is no longer an issue. In the current presidential election, we've heard some talking points from one of the candidates about voter fraud and all that, and I think if you do a Google search from some of the experts, they do say that the issue of voter fraud in the U.S. is basically a non-issue. That it's not what anyone would think it is. It's really not a problem that anyone needs to solve. When we look at activist campaigns now. It's probably been at least 10 years since I've been in a pit in Delaware, fighting over hanging chads. Are you seeing any issues like that today a lot where you go into vote challenges in the snake pits in Delaware?
Unfortunately not, because I loved those days, and I loved days in the snake pit. What's happened over the last however many number of years is that now, the vast bulk of all the shares of a publicly traded company are held through brokers that use Broadridge or Mediant or InvestShare, the two very smaller, proxy clearing houses. So all the voting instructions basically go to them, and they then cast the votes on behalf of the banks and brokers. So you don't really see the actual votes. You have to assume that they're being counted appropriately by both Broadridge and the other two firms, and you just see aggregate custodial totals. So it's very rare once the inspector puts out a preliminary tally that there's much to fight about.
Oh, I want to just get in our final few minutes here. I want to go to a couple of questions that people have emailed in, and again, if you have questions, feel free to put them on the either using the chat feature or on the Twitter handle #SHActivism political or hashtag #SHActivism political. One question is on ballot access, and I think this was a question that we had actually thought about in advance. Access to the ballot is an issue in U.S. presidential campaign. We have a third party candidate, but it's very hard for a third party to get on every ballot. So ballot access, obviously, an issue in the presidential election. In terms of an activist campaign, ballot access, isn't ballot access today also an issue, given the fact that we don't have today, or not likely to have this season, universal proxy? Art?
Well, I mean, I think, Keith, there's a difference. I mean, in the corporate context, there's a difference between access to the ballot, if you will, and ability to get the ballots out to people and have them vote. And again, I think it goes back to the question of costs and the fact that an activist has to pay the costs out of their own pocket. In that, it's in most instances, I can't think of very many cases where there's any material impediment to a shareholder nominating directors. But in the current state, that dissident has to prepare his or her own proxy statement, his or her own proxy card, and mail that out to the shareholders, all of which can be expensive. If it's a company that's largely institutionally held, the expense is not really necessarily that onerous. If you've got a situation where there's a lot of individual holders that need to be mailed to have a real impact on the vote, those instances can be expensive. So, access to the ballot is easy, but getting the ballots out can be a little difficult and could be expensive.
And now, proxy access, and I know we could spend an hour on proxy access, but do we think that now that proxy access is becoming much more common in terms of companies that have it, do we think that is going to be a factor in having more shareholders propose candidates to be included on the company's proxy?
This is Steve Brown. I guess to be optimistic or pessimistic, depending on where you sit, I could say maybe. But it's a right that most shareholders think they should have. But it's very difficult to actually execute, to have the requisite 3% or 5%, and get a group of shareholders together and agree on who's going to take the lead and agree on who your nominee is going to be. It takes a lot, and I think we all agree. It will happen in an extraordinary, egregious situation where a significant number or amount of shareholders in the stock are absolutely displeased with what's going on, in the company, and the company's been recalcitrant in responding to shareholders.
So it's more of a theoretical right, you're saying, Stephen? I mean, that it's not. It's
sort of a break the glass. Let's pull the lever when all else has failed, because it takes a lot on the side of the shareholders to do it, and you still have to win the vote. You still have to solicit. And again, going back to what was said at the very beginning, it's a factor of money and interest to spend the time and resources in trying to get your candidates over the hump. So it takes a lot in order to expend that type of resource, but it will happen.
Yeah, and I think that's right with respect to the call it mainstream institutional investors. With the exception of a couple of real cheapskates, the hedge funds who are the ones who have been really waging these proxy fights, they're not going to rely on proxy access. They're going to continue to do their own proxy statement, their own proxy card, and nominate that way and not go the way of proxy access.
So, guys, as we wrap up, any closing comments from anyone? Closing remarks on this comparison between activist campaigns and political campaigns? Okay.
This is Steve. Very quickly. There are a lot of great advisors, and all of them are on this phone call. But I always like to tell boards you can't abdicate your own judgment because it's your seat that's up, and they've been and so you ultimately it is your call about what you do, and the more you prepare for it and management prepares you for it, the better off you're going to be.
Credibility, and credibility.
Steve Ballot?
Just like unfortunately, the political campaign season seems to start right after the last election. I think boards of directors are more and more starting to focus on their next election earlier and earlier, and that's a smart move.
Duncan Harrington.
I think this has been a fun topic and a fun discussion. Keith, thanks for setting this up, and thanks to everyone on the panel. I've really enjoyed hearing everyone's perspectives today.
And Andrew Ritchie.
Yeah, I come at this topic from a different background than I think everybody else on the call, as a field organizer and a former spin guy on campaigns. So it's fascinating to me how those tools can be transferred over, and I hope that this is just the beginning of a longer conversation, and that we might be able to revisit this again in the future.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and that concludes our event today. I really appreciate our panelists. We're very busy, and I appreciate their sharing their wisdom and insights with us today. I think this has been a fascinating, spirited discussion. I want to remind everyone listening that there are a number of thought leadership pieces and presentations that I'm going to upload it to the event site, and you can download that at your convenience. To the extent you want to reach any of the panelists, their contact info, if it's not already posted to the event site, it will be posted shortly. I believe most of the panelists their information is accessible. If you Google any of us, it's relatively easily attainable. And I also want to remind everyone that an on-demand version of today's discussion will be available later this afternoon. So if you have any friends, colleagues who were not able to find the time today, this entire discussion will be available on demand on the compro.biz website. Again, thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. This does conclude today's teleconference. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time, and have a great day.